On the west coast of Africa, over 300 years ago, Africans were imprisoned in cells, chained and shackled, and shipped to the New World. Today, in the heart of downtown Manhattan, archaeologists have discovered an African burial ground, a startling and dramatic reminder of slavery in colonial New York. I'm John Rhys Davis. Join me as we unearth the slave trade, next on Archaeology. New York's financial center. Here traders buy and sell stocks, bonds, and commodities essential to America's economy. But in colonial times, a different kind of commerce ruled the area. Once a week, at the foot of Wall Street, slaves were sold on the auction block to the highest bidder. Unable to attract European settlers to the colony of New Netherlands, the Dutch West India Company depended on slave labor to work the farms, build the buildings, and raise the fortresses that would transform the struggling colony into the permanent settlement that today we call New York City. In 1646, an able-bodied man sold for 300 guilders, or $150. Women and children under the age of 16, half as much. Slavery was one of the most lucrative businesses in New York. A few blocks to the north of Wall Street, on 5 acres of barren land, lay freedom of a sort. From 1712 to 1790, slaves were buried here. As the years passed, the city grew, and the burial ground disappeared beneath landfill, concrete, and asphalt, and was forgotten. Then in June 1991, bones began turning up as surveyors marked out the foundations for a new federal office building. The rediscovery and excavation of the lost African burial ground quickly became an explosive situation. Community activists, government officials, and scientists wrangled over who would be the rightful caretakers of these sad remains and this country's African-American heritage. Meanwhile, archaeologists have begun unfolding a story forgotten for almost 300 years. A story of the largest city in the United States being built on the backs of slaves. At 290 Broadway, archaeologists uncovered some of the first human remains and artifacts of human slaves ever discovered in New York. As heavy machinery cleared tons of earth from the building's foundation, a team of archaeologists carefully excavated a grave in the African burial ground. The burial ground was discovered almost by accident. A study of the proposed area indicated the presence of a burial cemetery dating to the 18th century. But no one believed it would still exist. They believed that centuries of construction had obliterated the site. The General Services Administration, or the GSA, was required by law to conduct an archaeological investigation of the historic site, but the results exceeded anyone's expectations. By the fall of 1991, dozens of graves had been identified, and by the spring, hundreds of skeletons stacked up in the ground were uncovered. "390 remains of slaves and freemen would eventually be exhumed from the cemetery. Experts estimate that between 10 to 20,000 bodies remained buried. The existence of the African burial ground sheds light on an often ignored truth about the northern colonies. Archaeologist Warren Barber
Until this project, of course, scholars and historians knew that slavery existed in New York City before the Revolution and in the early part of the 19th century. But the general public, when thinking of slavery, associated it primarily with the South.
On the eve of the American Revolution, New York had the largest population of enslaved Africans in the country, outside of Charleston, South Carolina. It was a very different kind of slavery than the plantation labor we usually think of. Africans handled cargo on the docks and in the warehouses along the East River. They were farmers, boat pilots, sailors, shipbuilders, and construction workers. By the mid-17th century, 40% of the population of New York City was African. Kept in perpetual bondage to serve the needs of the growing colony, the drama of their daily existence was ignored by historians. The discovery of the largest and oldest African cemetery in America was big news. It should have opened a scientific window into the real story of New York and the slaves who built it. Instead, it opened old wounds and condemned the remains to a scientific limbo from which they are only now beginning to emerge.
This is the first chance that enslaved and freed Africans in New York get a chance to speak through the bioanthropology and through the detailed study of the archaeology over the next 4 to 6 years.
Unearthed after 300 years of neglect, the bones in the burial ground are beginning to reveal to scientists the vestiges of African culture that the slaves managed to take to their graves. But for anthropologist Mark Mack, there are still more questions than answers.
The result of these studies will give us a very clear indication of what these people faced 200 years ago. Was the work so hard that they died 20 to 30 years? Were there many males as compared to many females? How many children were buried in the burial ground? This will give us an indication of infant mortality and morbidity. How many kids got sick and died?
As many as 40% of those buried in the cemetery were children. One case illuminates these statistics. A baby cradled in a woman's arms is a reminder of human tragedy. Among these poignant remains are clues to African burial practices. At the time of death, pennies were placed over the eyes to keep them closed. Once in contact with the dead, the coins were considered unlucky and were buried along with the deceased. Most were laid to rest in simple shrouds fastened with metal pins. The remains of one slave was found with the buttons from a British naval officer's uniform. In another grave, a young woman was found with a musket ball buried in her ribs. The practice of nullification, crossing the hands over the chest, helps the soul achieve balance and ensures a safe and tranquil journey to the afterlife. These rituals were followed throughout Africa, but regional differences are hard to distinguish. Here, artifacts found in the graves are more revealing. A string of glass beads around the waist of one of the skeletons points to a West African culture, where objects with reflective surfaces were revered as windows to the hereafter. Cowrie shells were symbols of a passage across the sea or the journey into the afterlife. While scientists slowly uncover treasured bits of information about the slaves, the big questions remain unanswered. Who were they? Where did they come from? Uprooted from their homes on a continent thousands of miles away and 4 times the size of the United States, untold thousands of Africans would lose one of their most cherished possessions, their identity. Michael Blakey, project director and biological anthropologist.
People want to know where they come from, and somehow this defines them in a particularly powerful way. For African Americans, the origin question takes on another dimension, a very specific dimension. I, for example, don't know what my real last name is. My name is Blakey. The name that carries back to my African origins has been lost.
The busy seaport town of Elmina, on the famous Gold Coast in West Africa, flourishes despite its chilling past. Today it exports fish and agricultural products, but 300 years ago, its ships were laden with human cargo. The people of Elmina reflect a diverse mix of cultures from many North and West African regions. Some are believed to be the descendants of slaves brought here to work for the Dutch. At Fort Elmina, the headquarters of the Dutch West India Company, Africans bought by white slave traders from African merchants and kings were rounded up like cattle, branded, shackled, and herded into dungeons to await shipment to the Americas. Those who didn't die of disease or infections were stripped of all identity with home and family. Husbands and wives were separated and stored in cells according to their sex. Young men who tried to rebel were severely punished, then chained to the floors as a warning to the others. Viewed as commodities, their age, sex, and physical condition were all the information that was recorded. Archaeologist Christopher de Course is an expert on the slave trade.
Europeans didn't write about where slaves came from. They were concerned with getting the slaves to the New World. They were concerned with what the slaves' work would be in the New World. But they didn't record where the slaves originated. All we have is sometimes very vague and often very imprecise records of what ethnic group, what cultural group they may have belonged to.
We know more about the slave collection points on the coast of Africa than we do about the origins of the enslaved Africans. The English, French, Swedes, Danes, Germans, and Dutch established more than 50 of these forts. The slave trade stretched from the Senegambia in Western Africa, down around the coast across the modern countries of the Ivory Coast, Ghana, Benin, into Nigeria, and then southward to Angola. From this vast mosaic of regions and cultures, Africans were thrown together with no regard for their diversity.
The African cultures that existed in these different areas in the last 500 years had many, many different worldviews, different religious beliefs that they brought with them. They spoke different languages, and all these people were mixed together and transported to the New World.
When a slave ship was ready to be loaded, men, women, and children were pushed through these tunnels towards the waiting ship. At sea, the Africans were jammed together shoulder to shoulder, what slavers called close packing. Below the deck, the air reeked of excrement and disease. On the 8th day at sea, slave master Richard Drake entered in his journal, I took my round of the half-deck, holding a camphor bag in my teeth, for the stench was hideous. The sick and dying were chained together. I saw pregnant women give birth to babies while chained to corpses which our drunken overseers had not removed. The blacks were literally jammed between the decks as if in a coffin. On transatlantic voyages lasting 2 months or more, a death rate of 25% was common. Even so, slavery was good business. When the British gained control of the colony in 1664 and renamed it New York, the slave trade was thriving, and slaves were trained as a cheap source of skilled labor. By 1730, artisans complained that slaves were undercutting their ability to earn a living wage. Slavery had become tightly woven into the fabric of colonial life. To keep the blacks in submission, floggings were frequent and harsh. For minor offenses, slaves were sometimes branded, castrated, or hanged. But those who tried to rebel suffered the worst. After the New York slave revolt of 1712, the public packed lunches and watched for 10 hours as one of the conspirators was roasted alive. By law, slaves were not allowed to congregate in groups of more than 3 without supervision, and curfew was at sunset. In spite of these restrictions, Africans gathered nightly in the cemetery outside the city to venerate their dead and celebrate the continuity of life with drums and chants. Here in the burial ground, ancient rituals were passed from one generation to the next. Today, the burial ground is a testament to the thousands of slaves who toiled and died to build New York.
This is not just the history of African Americans in New York. This is the history of the United States. There is no burial grounds that is any older or is any more significant anywhere in the 50 states of the Union.
For 18 months from the discovery of the burial ground, the African American community tried to get the General Services Administration to call a halt to the construction on the site until a preservation plan could be formulated. But for 18 months, their pleas were ignored. Then, in July of 1992, New York State Senator David Paterson, along with scientists and members of the African American community, came before the United States House of Representatives to express their outrage.
Every single time we have asked for a fitting memorial to this site, it has been rejected. Every single time that we have averred that there should be some type of inclusion of African Americans in the actual study of the artifacts that are dug up, for some reason it does not happen.
Representatives of the African American community charged that the government-managed excavations were being rushed in order to clear the way for more construction. They asked for a temporary halt to the excavations, to create a plan sensitive to the spiritual and scientific concerns of the community. From the General Services Administration was its regional director, William Diamond. Representative Gus Savage, an Illinois Democrat, chaired the meeting.
I have been told that I would be responsible for up to $30 to $40 million worth of contract claims against the government. I cannot personally take that responsibility without authority being given to me.
Did you suggest to them that you should be permitted to suspend excavation at the pavilion site temporarily?
No, I did not recommend.
Why not? Then you don't believe you should suspend. What people here have testified, scholars have called the most important archaeological discovery in this century. But I'm going to do, Gus Savage, everything in my power to make you change your obstinacy and your disrespect for a sector of this city. And with that having been said, this committee
Gus Savage ordered a temporary halt to the excavation. A national steering committee for the burial ground was created to ensure the preservation of the site and determine the path of future research. Cheryl Wilson was appointed liaison director between the GSA and the African American community.
African Americans are always looking from the outside in at a situation like this, and the questions that are asked, the concerns that are focused, come from the European social scientists and not from the community itself.
Having first engaged a predominantly white scientific team to remove and store the bones at Lehman College in New York, the GSA, at the recommendation of the steering committee, ordered the remains sent to Howard University, the nation's leading black research institution. The first shipment, packed with extraordinary care by art conservation experts, arrived in September of 1993. Over the next 5 years, a team of more than 40 anthropologists, archaeologists, geneticists, and historians hope to shed light on the lives of the people of the African burial ground and provide a glimpse into what cultural practices survived.
The cultural practices of the society of which this person was a member is reflected in the skeletal biology, in this case, the teeth. One can see that the central maxillary incisors have been filed on the occlusal and medial surfaces. For his society, this was a sign of beauty. This is common in both West and Central African societies.
Deformed teeth are evidence of another common practice also found among the slaves, pipe smoking. Here the teeth have been etched or ground away over a long period of time by the constant use of a pipe. Clay pipes have been found in archaeological digs in West Africa, suggesting that Africans were already familiar with the custom, and some may have brought it with them to the New World. Fatima Linda Collier-Jackson is an anthropologist.
Well, what we hope to do with the African burial ground material is to focus on the extent of diversity within the population. We want to look at the relationship between specific individuals and populations currently in Africa, as well as specific regional groups of African Americans.
Not surprisingly, Africans from different regions are genetically diverse. By comparing the DNA of those in the burial ground to the DNA of living Africans, scientists may be able to determine where the slaves came from.
By using these various means to determine origins and population affinity, I think that we should be able to learn much more about who comprises the African burial ground population, and at the same time contribute to the development of the science.
And although construction of the federal office building continues, in October 1992, a presidential order forced the GSA to cease construction of a portion of the project. By executive order, $3 million was approved for a museum to honor the African Americans of colonial New York. And on March the 4th, 1993, the African burial ground was designated New York City's first below-ground landmark. And on April the 19th, it became a national historic landmark. Today, colorful murals painted by elementary school students commemorate the site and the history of slavery.
And as harsh as their lives were likely to have been, as human beings, these Africans were adaptable. They may have been victimized, indeed, but they were not simply victims. They acted on their lives. They created a culture that has been handed down to us today, that's made America and the world in which we live what it is.
The African burial ground and its long-forgotten remains give mute testimony to a time that many of us would rather forget. A time when the prosperity of the American colonies, both north and south, was paid for in human bondage.